Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start. And as people come in, Gloria, you will admit them, please. Might I ask that everybody stay muted unless there is time, during times of question and answer, we will ask you to unmute. Thank you very much. You're very, very welcome. And thank you for joining us today. We'll just bow our heads in prayer. Heavenly Creator, we come before you, pleading for forgiveness for our missions. Fill us with the fruits of the Holy Spirit, so that we might practice your will in cultivating love within and amongst all peoples. We ask that with your help, we fulfill the promises we made through our baptism. And we make our prayer in the precious love of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. We've planned a series of 6 workshops for teachers and chaplains. We are attempting to relate key issues to the life of the school. You'll remember our first session was on diversity, inequality, and racism in the UK. It was a challenge to Catholic education. Today, our second session is on the history of Britain as a diverse society. I would like to now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Helen Kilburn, who was at the University of Manchester, where she was awarded her PhD. She is now a lecturer at the University of the Notre Dame. Dr. Helen Kilburn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you for having me here and for everyone attending. I'm just going to share my screen so I can put the slides up. And get going. Okay, so this, as Yogi said, is a presentation about Roman Catholicism in the British Empire and Commonwealth, broadly speaking. So to begin, I just wanted to show you this map, because in the period before Catholic emancipation in 1829, the history of British and Irish Catholic migration to the colonies is somewhat obfuscated by their recency. In other words, you didn't want to be on the government radar for your religion at this point. But research in the National Archives reveals that after 1829, the number of records in the Colonial Office papers alone, and it later became the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, demonstrates that British and Irish Catholics were widely dispersed across the British Empire and Commonwealth, and that the Catholic Church had connections with both British and colonial governments. And the majority of those records relate to missionary work, but there are some controversial documents in there, those that relate to, say, for example, the child migration programs, which were programs designed to send white children abroad to bolster the white colonies, as they were known at the time, but also government attempts to encourage Catholic missionaries to report on what they deemed subversive activity, which was mostly communism or anti-colonial activism. So 450 years worth of history is a lot to try and cover in 25 minutes, 30 minutes. So I'm not going to cover all of it today. I'm going to focus on the foundation of the British Empire in the 17th century, which is my research specialism, and particularly the emigration of British and Irish Catholics to Europe and the Americas and the African diaspora as well. But I am going to pick up on a couple of key events just for the moment, just to redirect you if it is more the modern history that you're interested in. I will also say that there won't be as much on Asian history, because in the 17th century, the outlook of the British Empire was more westward facing than eastward. But nonetheless, there are two key events in the 19th and 20th century that we potentially should be paying more attention to. And the first is the development of Irish nationalism and its connections to the anti-slavery movement and the Catholic emancipation movement. Specifically, the African-American abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, and the so-called Great Liberator Daniel O'Connell were both allies and close friends in these movements in Ireland, the UK, and the USA. And the second is the fact that the civil rights movement and the Black Power movements in the US inspired the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, and this led into what we now call the Troubles. In both movements, leaders opposed institutional discrimination and segregation. For example, this scene here of the RAC officers charging demonstrators in Derry in 1968 was taken at a protest that was focused on the allocation of public housing, a one-man, one-vote electoral system, fair employment practices in the public service, and the restructuring of the RUC. So if you do want to kind of branch out and read more on that history, I would recommend a few of these books here, and hopefully I can send these slides out as well. But I'd also recommend New Beacon Books in Finsbury Park. They're also online, but they are a independent Black publishing house and book shop, and they're basically just like an absolute treasure trove for this history. But they also work with schools, colleges, and universities as well. So they're also a great resource. So like I say, my research area is westward facing and mostly British and Irish and African diaspora. And this is what historians call the first British Empire in the early modern British Americas. And this before the move towards Asia and Australasia typically happened in the 18th century, and then the 19th century, Britain had much more involvement in the African continent. That's not to say that there wasn't some contact with those continents during the 17th century, but it was mostly mercantile outposts, particularly those of the East India Company, rather than colonial settlements. So my research sits somewhere between Black history, British and Irish Catholic studies, and critical whiteness studies. And what this means is that in this period, the Atlantic slave trade and colonization by Europeans was advanced enough that the archives tend to yield two things. They tell us how white Europeans developed structures to alienate and better exploit Native Americans and Africans, but also how Native Americans and Africans resisted those structures. In the period immediately before, so around 1485 to 1660s, which is Onyeka Nubia's focus, and he's really pioneered this study, African presence in the British Isles was not as heavily associated with enslavement, nor was African identity so heavily identified with the concept of race as skin colour. But then this does beg the question, how was race understood in the later period of 1630 to 1829? And in short, prior to the 18th century, European colonists of all nationalities and faiths were inconsistent in their definition of race. But in the British Atlantic, the first move towards racialising enslavement began in Barbados in 1632, when the Assembly passed legislation that codified that a person with black skin colour without an indenture contract was considered a slave. And by 1661, when the English established their first factory in Gambia, opening up the Atlantic slave trade substantially to the English, the same legislature removed the indenture contract clause. So in that case, there was no escape from enslavement with black skin if you were transported to Barbados. For this reason, I argue that the lexicon of race in the early modern period may not have mirrored our own, but societies before the Enlightenment nonetheless utilised taxonomies of human difference. So early modern societies therefore engaged in racial thinking, which at times did centre on skin colour, but at others on religious, regional, gendered or class-based differences. But importantly, they nonetheless were believed to manifest in physical or behavioural features. So an alternative example to this is Edmund Spencer, who was an Elizabethan kind of polemicist, advised English Protestants who were migrating to the Ulster plantation in Ireland not to allow Irish wet nurses to nurse their children, because there was a belief in that period that Gaelicness and Irishness and Catholicism could physically be transmitted via breast milk. So it was a different understanding of but nonetheless engaging in a form of racial thinking. And for British and Irish Catholics specifically, changes to Christian interpretations of legitimate enslavement in the 15th and 16th centuries encouraged white Christians in Europe to associate slavery with blackness rather than with infidels, so that justifications for slavery shifted from religious exclusion to racial exclusion. And so British and Irish Catholics, this is what I found in my research, seem to hope to reinforce their belonging to an ethno-national community rather than a theo-national one, which had underpinned the Stuart ascendancy in the three kingdoms. So early modern British and Irish Catholics, particularly those in major cities and especially port cities, would have been familiar with sub-Saharan Africans. In his book, Black Lives in the English Archives, Imtiaz Habib has shown at granular detail that a significant Black presence in England is indisputable. And in fact, Rebecca Redfern at the Museum of London has shown that we actually have archaeological records that go back to antiquity. And as expected, these records show that these men and women worked, loved, married, had children, and died alongside white Britons. However, as a result of colonisation of the Americas, and particularly Iberian trafficking of West Africans there beginning in 1444, by the 17th century, England, there was a growing association in England of blackness with enslavement, which was supported by negative depictions of Black people and a growing gendered racist discourse, which distinguished white English Protestants from Muslims and Jews, Irish girls, European strangers, and English papists. Francis Dolan has shown that this discourse risked English Catholic belonging to the national community because it associated English Catholicism with Blackness. So the two images on screen are a good example of this. The one on the left depicts a Black slave who has captured his master's family and kills them, but not before he forces the master to cut off his nose in a vain attempt to save them. In early modern England, the nose was a symbol of fecundity, and its removal was reserved as a punishment for adulterous wives and sex workers. And then on the right-hand side, linking again this gendered racist discourse, women who were believed to have been involved with the Popish plot were characterised as the whores of Babylon. So again, this connection with womanhood, sex, and Blackness was very much tied together. But I really want to focus on British and Irish Catholics' exposure to free and enslaved Africans on the continent, especially in the major slave ports of Lisbon, Seville, and Nantes. So, for example, Philip Calvert, who was the Chancellor of Maryland, brother to the second Lord Baltimore, and under whose tenure the Maryland Slave Code of 1664 was passed, spent 5 years in Lisbon at the English College between 1642 and 1647. And in Lisbon, the Portuguese began to traffic up to 7,000 slaves a year to Brazil and 500 slaves a year to the urban economy in Lisbon. And it meant that a strong Black Creole population developed there. Importantly, the English College of Lisbon was situated on the Rua São Boaventura, which is just a short walk from the Rua de Poços de Negros, which translates as the Street of the Black's Pit. And this historically had been a pit that was established in 1515 by King Dom Manuel to combat the hazards of abandoned Black corpses in Lisbon's streets. And these slave pits were not unusual across all of Portugal. So the image on the right is from an archaeology site excavated in 2008, which is a midden pit that contained Black bodies who still had their hands and feet bound, and sadly, one woman still had a newborn infant in her arms. So against this backdrop, English Catholic emigres and those who were experiencing exile became a highly mobile, self-conscious community whose persecution in England requires that we don't collapse them into just the English diaspora, but we need to examine them as a migrating group in their own right, in what Jorge Caneres Esquerra describes as an Anglo-Iberian entangled Atlantic. So the other thing to remember is that English Catholics were not a fixed or homogenous group. They didn't act as a disconnected minority in the English Protestant Empire. Instead, they consciously adapted their political, legal, social, and religious praxis to meet the needs of colonial migration. But importantly, some of this praxis was learned in the colleges and seminaries in Europe, where theological justifications for enslavement and colonization were formed following Pope Alexander VI's ratification of the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1493, which divided the Americas, Asia, and Africa between Spain and Portugal. So Russell Menard and Dimitri Deeb have identified traces of Barbadian influence on the development of slavery in Maryland. They suggest that up to 60% of Maryland's slave laws were related directly to the Barbadian Slave Code of 1661, and they attribute this influence directly to 3 migrants to Maryland from Barbados: Thomas Nutley, Jesse Wharton, and Benjamin Rosa. And Jonathan Bush has argued that across the English colonies, legislatures enacted police measures rather than systematic legal systems of slavery adapted from Roman law, which was the case in Latin America. So we had the Le Code Noir in the French colonies, Siete Partidas and Leyes de Indias in the Spanish colonies. So Bush describes English slave codes as local slave law fashioned from bits and pieces of legal doctrine. And I expand on Menard and Deeb's conclusions by saying that those bits and pieces that Bush describes of slave law passed in Maryland, if it had no direct precedent in Barbadian slave law, in 1661, that it shows the influence of English Catholic planters and their Jesuit confessors applying to English colonial conditions their training in Baroque Europe and Latin America. So elite recusant Catholics who would have been educated on the continent were amongst the earliest slaveholders in Maryland. And these slaveholders were also benefactors of Jesuits who became slaveholders in their own right in 1715 at the latest. Thomas McCoog explains that in English Jesuit colleges, seminarians were trained to provide appropriate responses on casuistry to English Catholics troubled by the conflict between loyalty to the state and loyalty to the faith. And Jesuits also attended bi-weekly lectures on Thomas theology and participated in disputations on Thomas Aquinas' Summa from 1485, which was central to theological debates related to colonization and slavery within what was called the Salamanca School. And in Maryland, the Jesuit brother Francis Knatchbull produced a catechism for use in the Jesuit school at St. Mary's City, which was for lay Catholics. It wasn't a seminary. But this catechism was heavily influenced by Thomas theology. And this is an example of the manuscript from the Maryland archives here. So members of the Salamanca school included the Dominicans, Francisco de Vitoria and Bartolome de las Casas, the Jesuit priests Luis de Molina and Francisco Suarez. Their theology limited papal claim to secular power through the articulation of natural law, which was heavily indebted to Aristotelian and Aquilinian philosophy. Crucially, these theologians maintained that slavery was not a preordained condition, but rather slavery was a consequence of the capture of an infidel in just war, or the sale of a heathen who had obstinately rejected Christianity. This religiously coded racism meant that neither Muslims nor even hostile Native Americans, as depicted here by Theodore Debris on the left, neither of those two groups were perceived to be innately suited to enslavement. This articulation of natural law by the Salamanca school is described as Vitoria as the vincible man, refused to hear or did not believe what he did hear. On the other hand, I say that for invincible ignorance, it is enough that the man bestowed human diligence in trying to learn, even if in other respects he is in mortal sin. And so for this reason, it was considered that the enslavement of an entire race or nation was illegitimate. This argument influenced Pope Urban VIII in 1539 to denounce the enslavement of Native Americans as a group, and said that he argued it had no basis in canon or natural law. The Spanish monarchy followed suit and they outlawed enslavement of Native Americans by the 1540s, partly because the papacy voiced concern that enslaved Native Americans working under a brutal labor regime had restricted access to missionary activity. And that missionary activity was intended for the invincibly ignorant. It was not a theological rejection of slavery outright. However, Catherine Gerbener's research has shown that by the end of the 17th century, both Catholics and Protestants developed a colour-coded racism, which was based on the enslavement of, a colour-coded racism basis for the enslavement of Black people, which rested on corrupting, for that purpose, the medieval belief that Africans' black skin was an embodiment of the curse of Ham, that God punished Ham for witnessing Noah's drunken nakedness by cursing Ham's sons Canaan and his descendants to forever be enslaved to the descendants of Ham's brothers Shem and Japheth. So we can see here at the bottom right, we have Cush, who is a descendant of Canaan. He's represented as black. And the curse of Ham was a concept that was around in the 17th century, but it really embedded in the 18th century and reached its zenith in the 19th century when it was used as a counter-argument to abolition, abolitionists who were working within a religious paradigm themselves. So the catechism produced by Brother Francis Knatchbull around 1675, engaged in debates surrounding the conversion of non-Christians, which were integral to ideas about legitimate or illegitimate slavery. As might be expected, Knatchbull employs elements of Robert Bellarmine's Doctrina Christiana and Peter Canisius's Summa Doctrinae Christianae from the mid-16th century. They were the most circulated catechisms of their time. But he's also clearly sensitive to local issues. This catechism was written during King Philip's War, when Anglo-Native American and Anglo-French hostilities grew increasingly dangerous along the east coast of America. And Knatchbull advises Catholics that Catholics are all of one heart and one soul in matters of faith. And there are so many different nations and opinions, yet we all perfectly agree what we are to believe. But crucially, Knatchbull refers explicitly to the Thomas theology of Francisco de Vitoria when he explained to English communicants that those alienated from the Roman Catholic Church include those who are out of it through invincible ignorance, who are those who know no better and are not able to know better, at the same time to be disposed as if they did know better, they would embrace the true faith at any rate. Knatchbull continues that those who are invincibly ignorant will not have to answer for that, but will be judged for their other works. So we can be certain that the Knatchbull Catechism demonstrates that in an English colonial context, the Jesuits were sensitive to temporal concerns about imperial expansion and the presence of Native Americans within the English Catholic community, as much as they desired to educate colonists in the Roman Catholic tradition. Though we can be less certain about this, it's still nonetheless reasonable to suggest that this same theological framework may have helped the Jesuits to reconcile their mission with slaveholding in 1715. But just as important is this theological debate that was happening at this time is the wealth and slaveholding culture generated in the colonies, which circulated back into the British metropole and the British and Irish Catholic Church in exile on the continent, which it did, in one way, we can expect that to happen because it happened for a myriad of other public and private religious and secular institutions in the British Isles. But for an example, this image on the left was a portrait commissioned by the Second Lord Baltimore to market his colony. And he's pictured with his grandson and heir, surrounded by the trappings of empire, including a black page who is in the background. But because the black page is looking down, the white sisters don't even appear to be aware of his presence. He's offered more as an object of consumption. And so much like all of the black people who were recorded as only Negroes or mulattoes in the inventory records of Maryland's colonists, the child's life and existence is recorded, but he as a child is not remembered. And we have here on the right a map of all of the exile communities across the continent that were either British or Irish institutions. And the three blue ticks, were communities that were also existent in a slave port. So we have Lisbon, Seville, and Nantes here. At Nantes, you had the Irish College. Lisbon and Seville had both English and Irish colleges. This is important because if we take a look at the Meade family of Montserrat and Maryland, they became some of the wealthiest planters in the Caribbean. And they, if we look at the Legacies of British Slaveholding Project, Thomas Meade was the father of Bridget Meade, whose capital invested in 200 enslaved persons and probated in 1815 stood at £3,333, 13 shillings and 11 pence. Thomas was the previous owner of these slaves. And what we find out from Thomas's will is that he had another daughter as well as Bridget called Anne, and she was paid £10 a year having entered religious life. And Anne professed at the Augustinian convent in Leuven in 1749, where her dowry of 4,000 florins was paid. We can fairly confidently assume that that came from her family estate that was so linked to slavery. So, at the start of the presentation, I said that after 1829, British and Irish Catholics were deeply embedded in empire. That process started in the 17th century, when the first structures of institutional racism were built to support the Atlantic slave trade, from which both lay and religious white colonists profited. But in all that time, Black people always levied resistance. We have here a record for Thomas Haggleton, who was born in London to Black parents, baptized a Catholic in England, migrated to Maryland from Durham, and was forced to petition his freedom in Maryland's courts. He won the case and was able to sue for his freedom dues from the man who attempted to enslave him, Thomas Kemp. Kemp was subsequently forced to take a pauper's oath, whilst Haggleton used his freedom dues to purchase his own land. And Haggleton's success is remarkable for 3 reasons. Firstly, Alexander Shepherd has demonstrated that in the early modern British Isles, financial and social worth were assessed by communal acknowledgement of the value of an individual's real and personal property. In Maryland, Catholics were 14% more likely to own slaves. They owned more land and entered into political office at a higher rate than Protestant counterparts. In short, the status quo in England was reversed in Maryland. But something had also changed. Slave ownership in Maryland meant that early colonists inherited from England an understanding of worth invested in chattel-defined social status and subsequently creditworthiness. But that inherited worth, or that idea of worth that they inherited was transformed but not created by the ownership of chattel slaves. Secondly, Haggleton arrived in Maryland in 1670 at the earliest, and that was 6 years after the passing of this Act, the Maryland Slave Code, which established lifelong hereditary chattel slavery for all Black people arriving in the colony, but he was still able to achieve his freedom. Finally, in 1670, Baltimore introduced a property qualification of 50 acres of land in freehold, or a visible personal estate of £40 sterling for those seeking eligibility to vote. It was a measure that would have especially benefited slave owners following the passing of the Maryland Slave Code. Further to this, in 1683, in an attempt to reduce land speculation, Baltimore abolished the headright system, and the system had granted land to those who imported persons of British and Irish descent, but not African slaves. The system also granted servants who completed their indenture 50 acres of land. So all of these changes collectively ultimately served to disproportionately disenfranchise Protestant formerly indentured servants and to concentrate political power into Catholic hands. So when the Maryland Provincial Court found in favour of Thomas Haggleton in 1676, he subsequently registered a petition to claim his freedom dues of cloth and corn from his then present master, Thomas Truman. Truman appears to have somehow been able to get the obligation passed back to Haggleton's original master, Thomas Kemp, which Kemp couldn't afford to pay. And so he took the pauper's oath before the provincial court. And when he did in 1677, Kemp publicly acknowledged his insolvency, and in doing so, he suffered a blow to his worth in the society. The clerk recorded Kemp's indignant rejection of the court's decision to award Haggleton his freedom. The clerk wrote that Kemp made oath he is not worth £5 sterling, besides the thing in question about Thomas Haggleton, a Negro, his debts being paid. So presumably Kemp felt, I'm only poor because you've took my property from me. Haggleton was finally able to successfully sue for his dues of £3,496 of tobacco plus £672 of tobacco court expenses from Truman's estate in 1686, following the latter's death 2 years earlier. So for Kemp to have his worth publicly subjugated to that of a Black Catholic in 1677 in an English colony, where colonists might have expected to have a Black Catholic citizenship circumscribed both by anti-Catholic penal codes, as had been seen in England, but also the Maryland Slave Code, it was no doubt a humiliating defeat. However, Haggleton's success also had very real financial consequences for Kemp. When Haggleton successfully won his freedom in 1677, he did so when the headright system was still in place. Because Haggleton was British, Kemp should have been able to claim a headright for having transported him to Maryland, even if Kemp couldn't maintain that Haggleton was also a slave. But there's no record of Kemp having ever held land. So either he didn't have the capital to complete the survey, which I think is the more likely option, or the courts didn't believe that Haggleton was of British or Irish descent, but that wouldn't then make sense why they awarded him his freedom. Either way, Kemp lost out twice, because once the headright system was abolished, Haggleton's freedom meant that Kemp couldn't claim substantial property as a slave owner, or a landowner, and so he couldn't claim political rights. But by contrast, Haggleton is recorded as claiming his 50 acres of land for completion of his indenture on the 8th of December 1676, the same year he won his freedom. Potentially, Haggleton had the advantage of his faith. As I've mentioned, those in the colony who were best able to extend credit that would have been needed to survey his patent were mostly Catholic, and patronage within the community was very common. Thus, Thomas Haggleton, a Black Catholic, proved more successful in the colonies than his former master Thomas Kemp, a white Protestant, and that is in spite of the both anti-Catholic and anti-Black culture that was developing across the British Atlantic. So Haggleton, I'm just going to round up now by saying that I think Haggleton really displayed admirable resilience, but his history and that of other Black Catholics in early modern British Empire is little known. So I've got a couple of questions to pose to everyone in terms of how we might correct that. And first of all, I kind of want to highlight that the research conducted by the Royal Historical Society has found that BAMU students pursue history less often than white students, and that the academy is also overwhelmingly white. They argue that diverse history can only be achieved with a diverse academy. So what can we do in Catholic schools to play our part? And secondly, there are precedents set by Catholic institutions for making reparations to communities who continue to live with the legacies of empire and slavery. The most notable example is Georgetown University and the Maryland province for the Society of Jesus have made reparations to the descendants of those that they enslaved. And I just wonder, is this a model that maybe warrants more attention, or are there alternatives that we might look at? But hopefully we can discuss that at length. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was very, very good. What I just want to remind everybody that we are recording the session. So if anybody does not wish to be in the recording, could you please make sure your video is off? And I now ask that you put questions into the chat box, and Gloria will then send the questions through to Helen. So if anybody has any questions on what Helen has just given us, could you please put your question in the chat box now, please? Thank you. And I'll let Helen, if you pick those up and do them as they come through to you, please, Helen.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Okay, that was me trying to ask a type of question. Sorry, I'll get it right in a minute.
Oh, no problem. Okay, so I've got a question from Gloria on how do reparations work for the descendants in the context of Georgetown. They're actually evolving. What they're finding is the original solutions that they established in 2016, they're continuing to do the work, but the majority of it came via assistance to attend Georgetown University, and expanding it in that way, and because that was sort of an immediate position that they can take. From what I only read it recently, and I'm kind of remembering this off of the top of my head, but I think as well they made the student body or the student council made a decision to also create a fund where students themselves put in, it was something like $10, but to create a fund that came directly from the students as opposed from the institution, recognizing that they were themselves also beneficiaries of it. But if you go on to the Georgetown working group for I think it's Slavery, Memory and Reconciliation, you can read the full report of all of the recommendations that have been made. Yeah, sorry, Gloria. Okay, and I've got another one from Mary. How is this relevant to move towards anti-racism today? So I think to me, it's relevant and it's important because we can better understand how the church has actually developed within the Commonwealth. And so when as migration kind of continues, you're going to be able to have a better understanding of how different communities have engaged with Catholicism at different periods of history. And I think as well, it just means that we can start seeing diversity much sooner. I personally certainly didn't realise that there were Black Catholics living in London before I started doing my PhD research. And I think and again, you know, I don't want to kind of speak on Black Catholics' behalf, but that presence in my mind should be represented in Catholic schools and Catholic history to show that that's always been, you know, has long been a part of the history of the church in the British Isles. Again, I read, there's a great, I'll have to look, I'll find the link and put it into the chat box. There's also a great blog post about a Catholic who is of Nigerian descent, talking about his experience of going into churches in the UK and seeing only white iconography, for example, and that actually he felt a greater connection to gospel churches on one level, because he could see his African heritage there more clearly, but he still wanted to feel like he belonged in the Catholic Church, and so he felt very unsure where he really belonged. And I think that's what it's about. It's about belonging, and trying to ensure that is that by embracing that history, we're showing that we're willing to represent every Catholic communicant, because that's what Catholicism means, isn't it? It's universal, and that's what we should be aiming for and striving for.
Sorry, Ellen, can I just say you only have another 4 minutes, and would it be possible to read out the question before giving the answer, please?
Yeah, okay. So reconciliation. Okay, so I've got one from Gloria. How did they determine who to give the reparation to? My understanding is they had researchers who went and looked for the descendants. So they worked from genealogy and started tracking people down. So to make sure that it wasn't just a case of those who had the means to find out could come to Georgetown. So there's a great interview with someone who, when they actually tracked him down, it turned out he was working for Georgetown. And they didn't realise at the time. So yeah, they actively sought out the descendants. Okay, great question. So reconciliation is a word we are hearing more and more in many areas of our church life. When our knowledge of our Catholic colonial past is so limited, how does this process of reconciliation start? I would say actually doing the history first is the very first step towards that reconciliation. You need to acknowledge that history before you can then invite the community in to talk about how how that reconciliation should look, and it should be community driven rather than purely within the institution. That's not just something that I think is important for the Catholic Church. I think that is the community should be involved in everything, whether that is the Windrush memorialisation that Theresa May has suggested, or whether it's within the Catholic Church that the communities have to be involved in that process. But the first step is better understanding that past, I think. Thank you, Sue. So just a comment really from Susan, that knowledge of colonialism is more related to Presbyterianism rather than Catholicism, so more to go away, think about. So thank you very much, I really appreciate that. And I would also just like to say, I don't really have the answers in terms of reparations, and I think that's probably someone else's level of area of expertise, but I think it's worth having a discussion nonetheless.
Helen, thank you very, very much for that. I think Richard has one last question and then we'll move on. Richard?
It's not a question, it's a little story. And it's not directly relevant, but I think it's indirectly very relevant to what you've been talking about, Helen. Some years ago, a friend of mine who was a young Jesuit was teaching in a Jesuit mission school in South Dakota. And the Jesuit mission school obviously was entirely made up of students from Native American children on that reservation. And he walked into the classroom on the first day that he was going to teach them history, American history. And he asked them all to pick up their American history books and follow him. And he led them outside into the parking lot and asked them to put their history books down in a little pile. And he burned them. And he then passed out notebooks and he said to them, go back and talk to your parents and your grandparents and your uncles and aunts and the elders of the tribe and ask them about the past. So it's a little illustration that this sort of thing of needing to get beyond the history that is easily told to the history that is at least partly hidden is a process that is global, but that is very important to us in Catholic schools. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree.
Thank you very much, Richard. Can we express our very grateful thanks to Dr. Helen Kilburn for a very, very informative talk and for answering the questions. Thank you, Helen.
No problem.
I now want to introduce, sorry.
Oh, no, sorry.
Helen.
Thank you.
I now want to introduce you to Mrs. Nicole Moore, who is an associate to the Catholic Association for Racial Justice, and she's going to discuss an untold history of Black people in the United Kingdom. Nicole?
Hello, let me just unmute myself. Gloria, hello everyone, and thank you for being here, and thanking Kaj for inviting me to participate. Gloria, is it a simple thing? Do I just click share screen and will my PowerPoint, once it's open, be there? Please say yes. Yes, okay. Okay, let's see. Okay. I'm clicking on it, but it's not, is anybody seeing anything? It's not coming up.
Okay. I will make you a host, okay?
Oh. I'm seeing it now. Are people seeing it? I can see it.
It's coming up.
Can people see that first bit? Aspects of the history of Black people in Britain. Okay, great. So, okay, wonderful. So I'm looking at aspects of the history of Black people in Britain, and I say we came before the Windrush. Can the whole story ever be told? And I'm being a little facetious there, really, not because it's not true, but when I ask, can the whole story ever be told, what I'm really asking us to think about is the fact that there is no one story. Okay, there are so many histories, and I'm sure Helen would agree with me. As Helen, you are an historian, yes? Yes. So yes. So there are so many histories. Okay. Should I go on to? Okay, so there were Africans in Britain before the English came here. And this is the opening line by Peter Fryer in a book of his called Staying Power, The History of Black People in Britain, which came out in, I think, like 1984. Helen, if you were nearby, I'd give you a hug right now because you gave a big up to New Beacon Books. And I have a kind of family connection there. My sister has been part of New Beacon Books, and I am now part of New Beacon Books. And it's been around for a really, really long time. And I'm sure you know about the George Padmore Institute as well. So maybe we can have a chat sometime later on. Yeah. So people of African and Asian origin have lived in Britain for at least 2 millennia. They arrived here many hundreds of years before the massive forced migrations sparked by the slave trade and the British colonization of India. And by the time the SS Windrush arrived in 1948, famously carrying the first post-war arrivals from the Caribbean, Britain had a firmly established Black and Asian population. And this is a quote I take from the National Archives. So, you know, for some people reading that, you know, or even hearing that people of African and Asian origin have been here for at least 2 millennia, for some people, you know, like I've shared this fact with people before and they're like, feeling slightly mind blown, but the history speaks. Okay. The Romans, who of course had their time here, was it from about 43 AD until, I can't remember, Helen will know better, 43 AD until sometime, I can't remember the exact year. They sent African troops into what they saw as barbaric Britannia. And some of these stayed on when legions eventually left. And so in the images that you can see there, you will see that the one on the left, this is a tombstone of Victor, a soldier in Roman Britain, who is described as a Moorish tribesman and who died age 20 at South Shields in Tyneside. And also depicted on this slide is an image of Emperor Septimus Severus and his family in the 3rd century AD. He died in York into 11 AD. And some of you may know about him already. And you would know that he played a major part in sort of really augmenting Hadrian's Wall. And we hear stories, I've heard stories about him really not being partial to English food and sending forthwith for a cook from Libya to come to help him sort of to help with his nutrition here. And this is a part of a poem by the Roman poet Catullus, and it says, "I'm not overly anxious, Caesar, to please you or to know whether you're a white or black man." And I just added that there because one of the things that sometimes some people have trouble with is understanding that the Romans were not really so bothered about pigmentation and race. They were really interested in, you know, in kind of conquest and rule and so on. And so when Mary Beard, some time ago, she was under a lot of fire because she, in some people's minds, had the temerity to say that Roman Britain was a very, very racially mixed place, and there were people who had serious issues with that. Professor Hakim Adi, in his text for schools, The History of African and Caribbean Communities in Britain, I should have put a picture of his book, but an updated edition is coming out on the 22nd of this month, and he actually sent me a text only this morning to tell me that. He says, he informs us in that book, it's a really good text for students, I think, of any age. He informs us that some references tell of Africans invading Britain at the same time as the Angles and Saxons in the 5th century, and that Africans were usually referred to as blackamoors or Moors. That's a name given to the North African conquerors of Spain from 711 to 1492. During the Tudor period, 1485 to 1603, Africans were depicted in various works of art, and I have a few images up there. And the book, Black Tudors by Miranda Kaufman, gives a lot of information on this period. And for anybody who's interested in this period and in Black presence during this period, it's a really useful book to have. We certainly have it at New Beacon. I say here that despite Queen Elizabeth ordering the arrest and expulsion of Africans, first in 1596 and again in 16, on the grounds that they were taking food and jobs away from the English during economically difficult times, many stayed. And actually, it was actually the first time that Africans were being singled out during this Elizabethan period. It was the first time that Africans were being singled out. And yet, there are quite a few historians who would agree that racism wasn't like a big thing. It wasn't like this cancer that it came to be. Shakespeare's Othello was written some years after these deportations, and so I have some images there. One of course, of Elizabeth I, and then a painting done by a Spanish painter called, I think it's Daniel Munoz de Grain, and then the play Tragedy of Othello. Helen did touch on this. She spoke about the fact, I think she mentioned the fact that there sometimes can be a paucity of information about Asians in Britain during a certain period. So the National Archives tells us that Africans appear to have been more numerous than Asians in Britain between 1500 and 1850. This is because African people had been traveling to Europe in greater numbers since the medieval period. There were, however, more Indians in Britain at this period than we know about. They are often hard to identify in the record. Sometimes they're referred to as Indi, a term similar to the modern ethnic. Moreover, many of those called Indians in early modern English records are in fact Native Americans who were then more frequent visitors to the country. Officials also sometimes referred to Indians and Chinese people as simply as Black because many of them weren't Christian. They can't be expected to feature frequently, the NA says, in parish records of baptisms, marriages, and burials. And there you have a picture of an 8-year-old Lady Charlotte Fitzroy with her Indian page, whose name we're not given, in 1674, sorry. And so I'm just offering here the groups or individuals from the 18th and 19th century whose lives could be explored by students include Ira Aldridge, who was actually African-American, and he played Othello in 1825. Francis Barber, Equiano, who is a well-known name to some people, Ukaso Gronioso, Abdul Karim. Abdul Karim was featured, this individual, part of his story, how true or what, I don't know, was featured in a film. The name escapes me, but it was with Dame Judi Dench playing Queen Victoria and her friend, Abdul Karim. Dadabai Naroji, Mary Prince, Dulip Singh, the Caribbean soldiers at Portchester Castle, the Somali and Yemeni seamen, and Phyllis Wheatley. And these are just some groups or individuals that could possibly be explored by students, various year groups. I touch on both world wars, and we know, some of us, most of us know, that African and Asian subjects of the British Empire, including those from the diaspora, as I say, sacrificed or served. Professor Hakim Adi tells us that by the end of World War I, there may have been as many as 30,000 Black people in this country. In World War I, Africa contributed over 87,000 men. The Caribbean soldiers numbered about 16,000, and India's army numbered around 550,000 by 1918. In World War II, more than 1,355,000 African soldiers fought. Caribbean soldiers again numbered around 16,000, and India's army numbered around 2.5 million by 1945. The British Empire, that project was in many, many ways very successful for the British, for the empire. And so we jump, because you would imagine with the time given, I'm jumping around with this. The Empire Windrush's arrival at Tilbury Docks on the 22nd of June, 1948, and the disembarkation of the 492 men who traveled on it from the West Indies, as it was known, was captured in several newsreel images and sounds that have since become ironic. I felt it necessary to, in terms of putting the images up, to put images up of women, because people kind of make it sound as though it was just men. There were quite a number of women who traveled, and I did not mention it in this slide show, but Colin Grant, I mean, there are other books, but Colin Grant, whose latest book is one called Homecoming, and which looks at the Windrush, people who came on the Windrush and their experiences here. He gives numbers of the women who traveled. Now, here comes the big part. So I want this to work, and I'm sure it's going to work. So let's see if this works. Oh gosh. Oh gosh, it looks as though it's gonna work. Where's the arrow? I don't know. This is a little reel that I wanted us to have a look at. Oh, sorry. I'd like us to go back, and now I don't know how I can. Oh, sorry. Going too fast. I need to go back. Okay. Gloria, any directives as to how to get this video to work? I thought I was being a bit brave like this.
If you press right click onto the image, will it give you a play video? If you right click on the image.
See? Yeah, it's giving me, oh, I've right clicked and it says style something. I don't know. What does style? I don't know. Oh, yeah, maybe. Should I click? Oh.
So if you press preview, will that work?
Oh, it doesn't give me that. Oh, this is so annoying. And I know that it's...
Yeah. If you right click again, there was a green button that said preview. So underneath the paste options, you'll see it says preview with a play button.
Huh. Okay, let's see. Hopefully. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go. Let's see. Can people see? Is it big enough? Do I need to enlarge it a bit?
I think I found it on YouTube if you want me to play it on my screen via YouTube instead.
Is it, are you seeing it? Is it, sorry, is it not being heard or are people not seeing it?
I can't hear it, so I don't know if anyone else can.
No, we can't.
Can
Helen,
anybody
so
else?
No, we can't hear it.
Oh
We
gosh,
can
I
see
didn't realize that you couldn't hear it. Oh.
I can play it on YouTube and share the screen, and then we can switch back over to you if you like, Nicole.
All right, yes, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay. I might just say, some people might know this, but it was a surprise to me. I only found out this some months ago, that in one of the first frames that you see of the passengers who've come off of the Windrush, one of the young men is reading. He has a paper and the other men are around him. And he's actually the father of Andrea Levy, the writer who passed away last year and who wrote Small Island, among other novels. That was in fact her dad.
Wow. Right, hopefully this should work then if I press play now.
Yeah.
Film star Ingrid Bergman and director Alfred Hitchcock come in from Hollywood.
Helen,
Helen, share your video.
we can't see your screen. We're still seeing Nicole's screen.
Oh,
so Nicole,
okay.
could you stop sharing yours and Helen share yours? But we could hear it though. Thank you.
Hold on. I need to, oh gosh, I need to, okay, yeah. Yeah, can I, is that okay?
No, we can still see your screen, Nicole. I think you'll need to click stop sharing. It'll be a button at the top or bottom of your screen.
I'm not even seeing the, oh yes, I have seen it. Yes, sorry.
Yeah,
okay, yeah. Yeah, great. Thank you.
So can everyone now see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
England. Now it closes.
And here.
Tell me, I think that the diet in England is going to do you a lot of good. Doesn't really good, I'm not telling you. No. It's going to be good for you? Well, I don't worry about it, but I worry about you. Well, thank you very much, and please go on worrying. The Swedish-born actress, wearing no makeup, yet looking lovelier than Hollywood has pictured her, has come over here to star in a British film. Arrivals at Tilbury. The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans. Many are ex-servicemen who know England. They served this country well. In Jamaica, they couldn't find work. Discouraged but full of hope, they sailed for Britain. Citizens of the British Empire coming to the mother country with intent. Prodded by public opinion, the Colonial Office gives them a more cordial reception than was at first envisaged. Many are to be found jobs. Our reporter asks them what they want to do. You come to England to seek a job. And what sort of job do you want? Any type, so long as I get a good pay. Some will go into industry, others intend to rejoin the services. You are ex-Air Force, aren't you? Yeah. Are you going back into the Air Force again? Yes. Do you know if you'll be accepted? I think so. Some plan to return to Jamaica when conditions improve. I'd like to ask you, please, are you a single man?
I am a single man. Only my mother that is depending on me. And I'm also an ex-service man.
You're ex-service, RAF, are you?
RAF. I took a course in Scotland in case making. And I'm desirous of going back there to see if I can further, because I like it very much. And I'm trying to help myself and also help my mom.
Their spokesman sings his thanks to Britain. May I ask you your name? Lord Kitchener. Lord Kitchener. Now, I'm told that you are really the king of calypso singers. Is that right?
Yes, that's
Will you
true.
sing for us?
Right now.
Yes. London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia, or Australia, but you must come back to London City. Well, believe me, I am speaking broad-mindedly. I am glad to know my mother country. I've been traveling the countries years ago, but this is the place I wanted to know, darling London. This is the place for me.
Okay, thanks, Helen. Can we stop there? Thank you.
No problem. So you should
Okay.
share your
Yeah, let me
again.
go back. Yeah. All right. I come back up. It's taking thinking it's time to kind of be up there. Okay. Right. So we know that in the last few years, even though it was going on for some time, for quite some time before the story actually broke, that there was and there has been what is generally known as the Windrush Scandal. And so I don't know if this is a very brief thing. I don't know if this one will now work. Let's see. Tell me if you can hear, and if you can't, I don't know, Helen, do you know this one as well? Do you know this video? It's
there will be a place, Nicole, on your screen next to share screen that gives you the opportunity to share sound as well. You'll need to share computer sound.
Hold on.
If we can get the video playing, thanks.
Yeah, if we get the video. And I was...
Do you know what the title of the video is? And I can try and look it up on YouTube again.
Yeah, it's like it's the Windrush generation explained in something like 90 seconds, they say, or something like that. But it's yeah, it's not. Yeah, so I don't know if anybody noticed, as I said before, Andre Levy, if people have read Andre Levy. Yes, her father, and she didn't know, she never knew that her father came on the Windrush until she was a grown woman, and it formed part of a bit of one of her stories. But she said her parents never really told her, and her story is not unfamiliar. Lots of people I've spoken with say that their parents who came over in the 60s or even in the early 70s just wouldn't really talk about their lives in Jamaica, wouldn't really talk about too much about what they went through when they got here. But he was...
Sorry, Nicole, I think I have found the video if you want me to play it. It's up to you.
Okay, yes, let's just try. Yeah, it gives a brief sort of overview of what happened. Thanks, Helen.
No problem. So if you stop
okay,
sharing,
let me just stop. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think in future I won't even try with videos. Something always goes amiss. Yeah, this one.
Come to seek work in Britain and are ready and willing to do any kind of job that will help the motherland along the road to prosperity.
The relationship between this country and the West Indies and Caribbean is inextricable. When my parents and their generation arrived in this country under the Nationality Act of 1948, they arrived here as British citizens. Of British men and women denied their rights in this country under her watch in the Home Office. Can she tell the House how many have been denied health under the National Health Service? How many have denied pensions? How many have lost their job? This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun her Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I share the Honourable Gentleman's admiration for the people who came here from the Caribbean and contributed so much to our society.
I want to apologise to you today because we are genuinely sorry for any anxiety that has been caused.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. Okay. One of the things that really struck me about that video is the use of the word anxiety. Just anxiety, the anxiety caused. But okay, so I say that there have been several events, of course, many, innumerable events, but I use the word several here, that have contributed to post-war history and transformation in Britain. Some of these are, and I kind of have listed these as just kind of openers for study, for investigation, for research. So the first Caribbean-style carnival at St. Pancras Town Hall in 1959, coming as it did after the race riots in Notting Hill, pioneered by Claudia Jones, known as the mother of Carnival. And Claudia Jones was actually featured. She was the Google face yesterday. This was followed some years later. So she had this in 1959 at St. Pancras Town Hall, and then had a sort of annual indoor carnival. And then it was in 1966 that Rowan Laslett really kind of pioneered an on-the-street style, what would then go on to become Notting Hill Carnival on the street as we know it. And I say here that the rest is a number of fascinating histories, and I'll say no more because I've written about Notting Hill Carnival before for magazines. There are so many there's so many histories. Everybody claims to, this is how it started, this is who started it, and so on. So I just don't get into it at all anymore. The Bristol Bus Boycott of 1963, and that was very briefly to do with the Transport Authority there denying African and Asian workers the chance to work on the buses. The Grunwick dispute, students can explore the Bristol Bus Boycott, of course. The Grunwick dispute, and here I say that students can explore the role of Jayabin Desai. She was a formidable woman, and this dispute, the strike, this was in 1976. The Southall Uprising in 1979. I mentioned the teacher Blair Peach. He was from New Zealand, and he died as a result of being struck on the head by police. The Black People's Day of Action on the 2nd of March, 1981. And here, students can research the New Cross massacre as we at New Beacon Books and the George Padmore Institute refer to it, which prompted the march. And they can also look at the role of John LaRose and others involved. The Brixton Uprisings in 1981 and 1985, the Handsworth Uprisings of 1985, and the first Black History Month of 1987. And of course, there is so much more. And just some images of, a book on Claudia Jones by Marika Sherwood, an image pertaining to the Bristol Bus Boycott of 1963. That's a blue plaque there for Rowan Laslett, the woman who is credited with being the pioneer of the street carnival that Notting Hill has become. Jayabin Desai, the lady mentioned in the Grunwick dispute. Some demonstrators there in Handsworth, and some protesters and I don't know, police there at in Brixton, riots, and as they would call them, would prefer to call them uprisings. And that's an image taken from a photo taken from the Black People's Day of Action, and some of you would know about it and some people would remember. I had not come back to live here yet, but it was 25,000 people strong, primarily Black people. Is one of the biggest demonstrations by Black people in this country. And usually when I use the term Black, I use it as that political umbrella term, African and Asian peoples, and a book on the Handsworth uprisings there. New Beacon Books, I'm just mentioning, is a site of history. It is Britain's first Black-owned publishing house and bookshop. It was started in 1966 by John LaRose, African Trinidadian John LaRose, and his partner, Some refer to her as his second wife. He had been married to Trinidadian before, and then he and Sarah helped set up. Sarah helped him very much in setting up New Beacon Books, and it was very much a part of it. It has remained very much a part of the Archive Institute that he founded as well, called the George Padmore Institute. And so those are just some images. The first image is one of John with, he passed away in 2006, and he's there with people in the bookshop at one of the very lively readings that would take place there. Picture of the bookshop as it used to look. It looks a little bit more slick now, actually. And that is a picture of Sarah and my sister Janice, who has been with the bookshop really since she was about 21, and some images of books. The last book, the last cover featured there, Dream to Change the World, is a book that came out of an exhibition that we held on John, we had in 2015. And so people really kind of were clamoring almost for a book to come out of it. And so eventually in 2018, we did do that. And my last slide here, it's an image that I took. I went to the first Black Lives Matter demo in May, 31st of May, and I really kind of went with a kind of remit to myself to just kind of take as many photos as I could of the demonstrators, with their permission, of course, because I was very interested in the placards that people were making, because there were lots of homemade placards this time around. And I say that recent protests show us how much work there is still to do towards creating more equality, racial and social justice. But it also blessedly shows us just how much people's power and unity there is. All history is continuously being lived and made. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Apologies to everybody for the hiccups on modern media. I'm so sorry that happened, because it would have been so much better if we could just have it flow. We literally have 6 minutes for questions. So if anybody has a question for Nicole, could you please put it into the chat now? Thank you.
Somebody, oh, okay. I'm not seeing anything yet.
Please read out the question.
Gloria,
Nicole.
Okay, this is from Jess. Do you think that it's fair to say that Queen Elizabeth's attitude towards Africans in Britain was a catalyst for the change in the way that people in Britain viewed and treated people of different races? I would, yes, on some of course, on some level, that would be a very fair assumption to make. I think, though, that it's important to remember that racism, as I say, really wasn't, it wasn't as big a deal. That it kind of came later on. But certainly, yes, you could say that that was kind of one of the seeds. You know, that was certainly a seed that was planted. I mean, you know, there was some appalling things that happened, you know, later on. I mean, but the kind of arrest and expulsion of Africans was bad enough. But later on, you know, things became really more. I mean, with all of the arrests and expulsions, lots of Africans stayed, you know, in Britain. So, but yes, it certainly could be seen as a catalyst. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you. Yeah, the tech issues. I'm glad you enjoyed. There's a lot of misconception around the Windrush. My sister is saying, my father and grandmother, oh, it's gone. Oh gosh. Something, hold on. Things are going fast. Somebody's asking, there's so much history to learn and oh, right. Somebody's saying their father and grandmother came over on the Windrush from Trinidad and on holiday, not to stay. There were 1,027 people, including, that's right, Poles and English, and not the oft quoted 492. I know. Yeah. I don't know, the myth about them being almost all Jamaicans, it really is it kind of almost goes hand in hand with, you know, what people talk about when they were asked, they would, you know, all Caribbean people were seen as Jamaicans long ago. And I remember my father saying that, you know, on a level, the Jamaicans, because they really didn't put up with the racist crap, they would just like bust you up. He said, so on a level, you were kind of sometimes happy to say, yes, I'm Jamaican. You know, people didn't really get it with the accents. But yeah, that's something that we need to kind of, wherever we see it, let's put it right. Susan Kambalu, thank you very so much, History to Learn and Share. I've recently really enjoyed, David Olashuga's Black and British. Yeah, that's been selling very well. And yes, a version for young people has been published. You're absolutely right. Okay, so that's just a general for everyone. I'm not seeing any more questions. But the myth, yeah, going back to the Jamaican myth, I think because Jamaica was kind of like one of the first Caribbean countries that the English seemed to really hear about. So they just kind of held on to that. And if you came over and if you were Black and you said you were from, you know, from the Caribbean, or as it was then, the West Indies, people would just automatically assume you were Jamaican. It's a bit silly, really. Yeah. Any other questions? Running out of time, I think. No, that might be it. Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you so much.
Can I just say thank you very much to everybody for coming, and thank you for the questions as well. Helen, would you like to have a minute or two?
Well, really just to say thank you again to Nicole, because I think she gave a much broader history of Black presence in British history, I think, which is really important, not just the Catholic side of it. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Helen. Nicole, do you want to round up?
Oh, thank you. Oh, okay, no, okay. Just that I mean, I didn't touch on Catholicism, as it were, but I just feel that when we sometimes when we talk about, actually, I'm not going to round up. Can I be allowed to let Benjamin Zephaniah round up? There was an article of his in the Guardian, and I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, or even 3. And he said, now I love history. It is fascinating, illuminating, and stimulating, but I don't want to live there. Black history is not perfect. We have had our dictators, our massacres, our warmongers, our evildoers, and we should not shy away from that. But we have also had our pioneers, our universities, our inventors, great writers, great poets, scientists, cartographers, teachers, and philosophers. The police who beat me up didn't know that, because he talked in the article about being beaten up more by the police than by the National Front. He says that we need Black History Month now more than ever before. If we really want to understand what's happening in the world and change it for the better, we must confront the past and learn from the past, good or bad. We owe it to ourselves and future generations. And then he invites us to now go listen to some reggae. Go on, turn up the bass, he says.
Thank you very much. My thanks to Helen and to Nicole for the presentations today. I'm hoping and praying that it was helpful to all of those who have given up their time to come and listen to us for the hour and a half. I'm going to now ask Helen if she would please close with a prayer. Helen?
Yeah, no problem. So actually it's, I suppose, a bit of an off the cuff one, but I'm going to get it up. Close with a version of the Salve Regina from a Black activist from the 17th century, the Congolese saint, Donna Beatrice Kimpavita, who under her tenureship, when she resisted the Portuguese, ended the slavery in the Kingdom of Congo. And if I can find it, she says somewhere.
While Helen is finding the prayer, can I just say to everybody, if there are any questions or any comments that anyone wishes to make, we would be very, very happy for you to send them through to Gloria Ohm, who is our administrator at the Catholic Association for Racial Justice. And for any other information that you wish to look at, if you go to our website, you'll find it there. Thank you. You okay there, Helen?
Yeah, sorry about that. I found the Camp Bindu version rather than the actual the English translation. So she says, Salve you say, and salve you do not know why. Salve you recite, and salve you do not know why. Salve you beat, and you do not know why. God wants the intention. It is the intention that God takes. Marriage says nothing. It is the intention that God takes. Baptism says nothing. It is the intention God takes. Confession says nothing. It is the intention that God takes. Prayer says nothing. The intention God wants. God serves nothing if the intention that God wants. Good works, serve nothing. It's the intention God wants. So I think for me, that is it's about a lived Catholicism. And so I would like to just end saying, we ask that God gives us the strength to be able to continue to do good works and to do them with a full heart, to recognise how difficult that can be at times, but also to take the strength that Christ showed when he made the ultimate sacrifice. So Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer.
Hear our prayer.
Thank
you
so
very, very much, Helen. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.